Hi, it's Penny here. Welcome to another reading vlog. This week, it's the week after Christmas, and I'm going to start reading The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. This is actually a reread for me. I have read the first 3 books. I have the 4th book, but I haven't read it yet. I decided after having read the 3rd book that I wanted to go back and reread the whole Cosmere before I read that 4th book, just to have as much information as possible, because I just feel like there's so much going on in this particular series, the Stormlight Archives, but also the bigger connected Cosmere that is going to feed into that 4th book. And when I read a lot of these initially, I just really didn't know enough about the world to pick up on everything. So I'm really looking forward to this reread and picking up on a lot more than I did the first time. And I think right now I'm not going to give a synopsis of this, but we'll see as I go through and I remember what the first book was like, if I can come up with a good synopsis. But I will try not to spoil things, so I'll warn you if I think I'm going to spoil things. As well, I'm actually not going to read this. So this is my fancy edition. I have fancy editions of the first 4 books. They just kind of have nice end pages. This first book isn't as nice as some of the later ones, but it's still nice. And it has illustrations throughout the book that kind of add to things, like this one. And just the whole layout of these books I find really beautiful. So I'm not going to read this though, because it's just too nice, and the pages are quite thin, and I'd worry about damaging it too much. So I do actually have the Kindle version that I'm going to read on my Kindle, although I've just remembered I rearranged my bookshelf and I no longer know where my Kindle is, but I will find it and I will read this on that so that I can kind of highlight sections and make notes, because I really do want to try and pick up on as much as possible while I'm rereading this. As well, this week I will be reading an audiobook. I always have to have an audiobook on the go, and I thought I would try and pick a similar-ish fantasy series while also trying to work on my goal of series 0, where I'm trying to catch up and complete every series that I have in progress. So the one I'm going to be listening to is the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th books of the Jaran series by Elliott. This is another one similar to the Stormlight Archives, where it's mostly a fantasy. I'm thinking Jaran isn't that fantastical. It's actually more of a sci-fi. This has potential for some sci-fi elements to eventually come into things, although I don't really know how much is going to in this series. But in the Jaran series, so basically humans have gotten out into space, and we have discovered that there is already this alien race kind of ruling this galactic empire that we then become a part of. And there's this one human that kind of leads this rebellion, and because of the way that this alien race's culture works, he then becomes a very important figure and the leader of the humans from their perspective. And he's kind of trying to work within this galactic empire to get humans more autonomy, let's say. And the aliens are their culture is very different. But actually the story doesn't really focus on him or the aliens, although they're there. It focuses on his younger sister, who's technically his heir, and she kind of gets wrapped up in things and ends up on this planet where there are a bunch of people, mostly nomadic, who don't know anything about the rest of the space stuff. They're not there in terms of technology. She ends up staying with this nomadic tribe and really building a lot of bonds. There's a bit of a romance, even though I think it's a bit toxic. In my 20s, I did enjoy it. So she kind of is living with this nomadic tribe on this planet in the middle of nowhere, but there's some connections to what's going on in the bigger galactic empire. So the 2nd book, all I've gotten so far from it, so I listened to I think the first 2 chapters, maybe just 1 chapter, seems like there's this theatre group from space that's going to go to travel around on this nomadic planet, because basically this human leader guy has set himself up as seeming like the king of this city on this planet, and he's got a bunch of schemes going on. So I guess this theatre group's going to go there, and Tess, the main character, is going to be living with her nomadic tribe, and some stuff's going to happen. I don't know what yet, but I'm excited to continue the series. I think I actually said at the start of this intro that this is going to be a weekly vlog. Normally I do weekly vlogs. I expect that this is going to take me 2 or 3 weeks to get through, and as well I'm going to try and get through as many of the Jaran audiobooks as I can. So I've read book 1 already. I've got book 2, book 3, and book 4 on audiobook. They're quite long audiobooks, but maybe I can do it. Maybe. Hi, 'Cause I 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 'cause I
lazy Sunday mornings, hiding under covers. I don't mind staying in with you. Play your favorite movie, laying right beside me. I don't mind when it's just us two.
Hello, so I've made it to the end of part 1 of The Way of Kings, and actually I think when I first started reading the ebook it was saying it was going to take me 40 hours. It very quickly dropped down to like 36, and I think in the beginning it was coming down quite slowly just because in the beginning there's so much information and also like so many things that on a reread you're picking up on that you didn't pick up on the first time. So like I think I was going quite slow in the beginning, but now it's like 24 and a half hours to go, which is still a lot, but like maybe it's possible I could get through this in the next week and a half-ish, maybe. Anyway, also I do have the book open behind me. I've been trying to keep it kind of where I'm up to, because even though the ebook version does have the pictures, I'm using it as a trigger to remind myself to go and look at the actual picture because it's a lot easier to see the pictures in the physical book. But I am also liking reading the ebook because I can really easily highlight bits that I want to take note of, and that's helping me to like pay attention to all the details, which is what I wanted to do on this reread, right? So I will say this is really good. Rereading this, like it's so rereadable. There's so many things that there's no way I would have understood them on a first read. Like just the first prelude. I remember actually when I first read this book, I was like, there's a prelude, then a prologue, and then finally we get to the actual main characters. And I was like, what the hell? But on a reread, I really appreciate that. And I know in the prelude, there's so many terms used that the first time I read it, I wouldn't have understood it all. But now I read them and I go, I know what's going on. So I'm really loving that. So basically in the prelude, we're mainly learning about the mythology of the world, but there are these very powerful people who are being constantly tortured, and then every so often, every few hundreds of years or something, look, I'm forgetting the details again already. Anyway, regularly there's this desolation where they kind of have to fight for humanity, and they're sick of it. And so things are going to change going forward. And then it actually said the amount of time. So the prologue is 4,500 years later. So quite a lot later, and there's definitely a lot of references throughout the story to things that must have happened way back then, but now it's like complete religion. A lot of people don't even really believe that it happened, but because you got that prelude, you know that it did. Then we move into the prologue, and in the prologue we're learning a lot about the magic through this attempted assassination on the king of this particular kingdom. So the magic in this world is powered by Stormlight, which is basically just this light-based energy that can be used in different ways. The assassin that we are following in the prologue is using it basically to like manipulate gravity. I will say in a lot of ways these action scenes are very similar to the Mistborn ones. Just in Mistborn they're using metals. They can pull and push against metals and so move around like that, whereas in this one he's changing gravity, and again he can use that to move around in crazy directions or make other things move around in crazy directions. So the action is very similar. And I would say I don't normally like really heavy action scenes or battle scenes, but because while you're getting this action scene, you're also learning so much about the world and so much about the magic, it's a good distraction. And so I don't mind it too much. I think maybe that changes a little bit later in the book or in the series, but for now, I didn't mind it too much. And then after the prelude and the prologue, we moved into part 1 where we get introduced to Shalon and Kaladin, who I would say are our main perspective characters. We definitely get other perspective characters introduced. They are all very important, but it's probably Shalon and Kaladin that I still see as the main heroes of the story. So we meet Kaladin when he's really at this high point. He's fighting in the army, and even though he's like a lower officer, there's a lot of respect for him. And then the next chapter you see him and now he's a slave at a complete low point, and the mystery is like, how did that happen to him? And I think this first book really focuses on his backstory and letting you know how that happened, as well as progressing the story forward. And then each of the further books also gives you the backstory of another one of the characters. So we've got Kaladin, who was a soldier, now he's a slave, and he's pretty depressed about his situation. And then we also have Shalon, who is this young woman who is going through some really hard times, and she's attempting to become the ward of this, actually the princess. So the king who was being assassinated, his son is now the king, and his daughter is this like anti-religious scientist, very studious woman with some amount of magical abilities, and Shalon wants to try and become her ward so that she can like use the money and the prestige she'll get to sort out her family's issues. Or does she have actually another secret plan? Maybe. Again, it's really interesting, both Kaladin and Shalon's story, because I know their whole backstory. So like picking up on so much more of what's actually going on is really interesting. So also let me talk a little bit about the magic, because I talked about it briefly with the gravity, but there are also some other things going on. So we have Spren everywhere. Spren are like little creatures, maybe, that are attracted to certain things. So there's flame spren that are attracted to fire. There's rot spren that show up when there's rot. There's pain spren when there's pain, or hunger spren when there's hunger, or creativity spren, I think they were called, when people are being creative. So we're getting introduced to a lot of these different spren, and this is another like rereadability point, because I know so much more gets done with the spren throughout the series. As well, we have this thing called soul casting. So there are certain items called fabrials that have been invented. The soul caster is like this thing you wear on your hand, and you can use it to change certain objects into other objects. And the better the soul caster, or the better the person using the soul caster, it's not really clear yet, but I know. Depending on that, depends on how many different kinds of things they have the possibility of converting, but that's also being used in really interesting ways. So I'm really loving my reread, because there is so much complexity and depth to this world that on a reread you pick up on so many more details, and also you know how many of those details are going to become important later on. It's just so satisfying. I know some of my Cosmere rereads haven't been as satisfying on a reread, but Stormlight Archive so far is giving me everything I wanted. So next I'll be up to part 2, which it says is going to focus on Dalinar and Adolin. So Dalinar is the brother of that king that was assassinated, and then Adolin is his son. Also very important perspective characters. I think it's the 3rd book where you get Dalinar's backstory and a lot more focus on him. And I know a lot of people love Dalinar. They call him Daddy Dalinar. He's not my favorite, but I'm interested to see how it will go on a reread. Also Adolin, he's kind of like white bread, kind of boring, but again, we'll see how he goes on a reread. Oh, as well, I feel like I've been talking forever. As well, I did read some of Unearth the Crown, the 2nd Jaran book, this morning on my run. I am now about 3.5 hours into a 20-hour audiobook, like nearly 20%. Wow, I went on a really long run and I hardly got anywhere. Anyway, mostly I've been surprised it hasn't been focusing much on this planet of nomads yet, even though we're mostly following these characters from the theatre troupe, and also from Tessa's brother, this rebellion leader, his like main group. There's kind of a bit of a romance budding between a couple of those, so like a lady from the theatre and this guy that works for Tessa's brother, but also this guy is kind of a jerk, so I'm not sure if that's the relationship we're meant to be hoping for. There is also a nice, kind, sensitive guy that I'm hoping she'll actually end up with, but the romance in the first book is super toxic, so who knows which way it will go. There are a lot of really interesting concepts though around culture, because not only do we have this planet of nomads that's like got very little technology, and their culture is very different than the main human culture that is a lot like ours, except, with more technology. We've also got this alien race, and I love the way she writes them like so unhuman, and there's so many things that the aliens do that the humans are just like, we don't understand why they would do that. And like you read it and you don't understand it, but you can kind of see that maybe from a completely different alien culture's perspective it would make sense, even if you don't understand it. And I really love the way that's written. There was also a line that really stuck with me where she talks about how we shouldn't really call the people on this nomadic planet primitive just because they don't have technology, because that's just showing our bias for a technological culture, but it's not necessarily better. So there's a lot of really interesting concepts in this. It's kind of, though, I feel like a sci-fi romance. Like, is that even a genre that exists, really? I don't know, but it's interesting. It's interesting. One other thing I wanted to show you is I did go shopping and buy myself a couple of books for a Christmas present, mainly because we scan our groceries and then get vouchers as rewards for some marketing company. Anyway, I used my vouchers to buy books and I'm excited about them. So I bought the first two books from the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks. I've actually already read this, and admittedly, there's some problematic elements in this series. However, I did also really love it. Like, it's such an interesting series and I love the world building. So I wanted to buy my own copies of these books. I do have the third book in these editions, and that's all. But also, new covers have just been released. So if I don't buy these covers now, I'm going to end up having to buy those new covers, and I kind of think they're ugly. So I decided to get these. I have also online ordered the fourth and fifth books, so then I'll have the whole series in pretty editions. So pretty happy with that because they're essentially free Christmas presents. Or at least I put in very little effort to get these. Although it's a bit of a problem because I recently boxed up most of my books and put them away, including the third book from this series. And I'm trying to keep all my nice books, though, on my shelf, which is where this should really go. But now I don't have the third book to put with these. But also, there's no room on my shelf for these. So I don't know what I'm doing with that. But I'll put them somewhere for now until the other ones show up. And I'm going to try and see if I can finish part 2 of The Way of Kings in the next couple of days. I haven't done the maths to know if that's realistic, but that's going to be my goal anyway.
I do better things with my time than trying to make you jealous. Why can't we move on with all that?
Look, so it is now 4, 5, 6 days later. I'm not sure. I know I said I thought I could get through part 2 in 2 days, but I did say I didn't do the maths. It actually took me, I think, about 4 days, and then I haven't read much today. And I have also read the interludes, so I didn't really talk much about the structure of this book, but I do think it's somewhat relevant. So basically, this book has 5 parts, although I think it's parts 2 and 3 that are the longest. So having made it through part 2 is good progress. I think I'm actually about halfway through now. As well, between each of the parts, we get these interludes. So the interludes follow like random other characters. So for example, the first 3 interludes, there was one from this man who lives in this place where there's just this giant lake that's kind of quite shallow, so you can walk around in it, or at least the part he was walking around is shallow enough for them to walk around, and their villages are just built in this lake, so they're kind of used to like sitting in the local pub with their feet in the water. But there's this guy has some visitors coming from a different place, and so they've made allowances for them to sit at a high table so they don't have to get their feet wet, even though he's like, I don't know why they wouldn't want to have their feet wet. Anyway, in terms of readability, that particular interlude was great because, again, the first time I read that, I had no idea who these other guys were that were coming to ask, like, have you seen this guy? But now I know who the guy is that they're looking for, and I have some ideas about who they might be, and just like, it's really nice reading it and having that knowledge that I've gained through rereading the Cosmere and also through actually the secret projects that came out this year. I learned a lot about Hoyd, even though I also learned that I don't like Hoyd. I learned a lot about him, and I think I like him more in these books, but we'll see whether that continues once I get to the later books. He's still fairly minor in these ones, but yes, lots of rereadability going on. So the other thing is I've been reading the main parts. So each of the main parts, I think I said this last time, follows just like a few of the perspective characters. So in part 2, we didn't get any of Shalon, which I kind of am glad part 3 is going to have her again, because actually not so much because of Shalon, like she's fine, but I really like Jasna, the princess that she's now kind of being mentored by. And like, I know that Jasna knows so much more about what's going on with the world than Shalon. Like, basically she knows more than anyone, and that's why I like her so much. We did also, luckily in part 2, get a lot of Kaladin, just kind of Kaladin trying to figure out how to turn his life around and improve the circumstances for everyone around him. And I really like his motivation and his goals and how he's pushing through so much depression and how easy it would be for him to just give up. Like, I love Kaladin's perspective and also everything we're learning about the world through Kaladin's perspective. As I said, Dalinar and Adolin, not my favorite. A lot of what we're learning from their perspective is like the setup of these war camps and like the politics of this group. Basically, we have the king and then we have all these high princes underneath him, but they're very competitive between each other. And even though they're kind of participating in this war against the Pashendi together, they're not really together. And so that's why this war has like dragged on as long as it has. And we are also learning a little bit about the Pashendi, but I guess who's actually learning it? Jasnah. So there's quite a few battle scenes as well, especially in Dalinar and Adolin's perspectives, and battle scenes just aren't my favorite. So I struggled through those bits a bit. And even though there is some interesting things that are coming up in Dalinar and Adolin's perspectives, I just find them much more of an effort to get through, whereas Kaladin's bits, I just fly through it. And we are continuing to learn or like get little bits of Kaladin's backstory. So I'm still really loving this and I'm really excited to continue. I will say, actually, part of why it took me so long to get through that is just life. I did sell my car, which I'm a little bit sad about because I did like my adorable little pink car, but I never drive it anymore, so it made sense to get rid of it and not pay all the bills on it anymore. I think some other life things happen too. I don't know, the new year. Actually, it's the new year. By the time you get this vlog, though, that'll be old news and we'll all be used to being here. Hopefully 2024 won't be worse than the previous years. Is that the best we can hope for? Probably. Oh, actually, I do also, let me put that over there. I do also need to update you on the Jaran books. So I think, let me check. So I think actually, I was going to say further, but I'm only about 60% of the way through the second book so far, which is not that much progress. But I didn't do as many runs over the Christmas and New Year's period, so that's why. It's actually really strange because so far a lot of this is just this group of people moving around, learning about this other culture, planning their little plays that they're going to put on, and the romance doesn't sound particularly engaging, but actually I find the story just really engaging. I think it's that the characters all feel really real, and like the things we're learning about the culture and the technology also seem just like genuine problems that people would have to deal with. Also, interestingly, I thought really that this book was still going to focus a lot on Tess, but it's much more on this other woman who's kind of now in the middle of a love triangle between her, this guy in the prince's or this rebel leader's retinue, and then also this guy from the nomadic tribes. And I think it's trying to kind of compare this new girl's perspective of trying to integrate into this new culture with Tess's experience, because Tess was like so knowledgeable about languages, like really fast at learning languages and just really experienced at like analyzing new cultures. And so she was able to fit in very easily, relatively. And so now we get to compare Diana's perspective to that. But we do also still have some bits of Tess and her rebel leader brother trying to convince her to come back, which she isn't particularly interested in doing. So like, I'm interested, I'm engaged. I have seen some reviews saying that this book doesn't really stand alone. It has to be read with the third book. So luckily I have that lined up to pick up next. I do think I'm probably not going to get to that fourth book by the time I finish Way of Kings, but we will see. You never know. You never know. Hello, so I have made it to the end of part 3. I think my Kindle is saying that I'm about 70% of the way through. Part 4 I think is about the same size as part 2 and part 3, but then part 5 is really short. So once we've read part 4, we'll be pretty much at the end. And I am still like following along in my big book along with my Kindle, which I am finding very useful, again, just mainly for looking at the pictures, but also like it makes me feel like I'm making progress. That is like the downside of a Kindle. Yes, you have a little percentage bar in the corner and I have the time counting down, but like you don't get the same kind of progress feeling as you do in a physical book. Anyway, part 3. A lot of things have really started to come together. We've learned a lot about Kaladin's backstory now. And I think there's a little bit more to go, but mainly like we know how he ended up in such a terrible position. And actually, I did want to say trigger warnings in this book definitely for like suicidal ideation, even in Shalon's story as well, but more in Kaladin's story. And I know it's something he struggles with throughout the book series. So I'm really enjoying my reread as well. Definitely there's a lot of readability going on. I know that the first time I read this series, when I got to some of the stuff that happens later on, I felt like it came out of nowhere, but rereading it, I can see that it's all there. I think what Brandon Sanderson does really well is he's honestly just telling you the stuff that's going to surprise you later, and maybe if you're observant you can pick up on those things on your first read, but he's like putting it right there. But because he's building such a complex world and there's so many characters and so much going on in the plot, it's almost buried. And so then when you do finally figure out how all the pieces come together, it feels like amazing that he was able to like place all those pieces right in front of you, but you weren't able to see it. But of course, on a reread, you can pick up on all of them as you go, even though I definitely don't remember everything. And actually, let me check my notes because I know I wanted to talk about some other things as well. Oh yeah, so a big theme that's going on in this book is religion. So much of what's happened with this mythology that we learned about right at the beginning of the book, like with what happened with these heralds, they call them the heralds, that were like reliving through these desolations. So everything that's happened with them is kind of very connected to the religion, and in some characters' lives, religion is a big influencing factor. And what I really find interesting is I know Brandon Sanderson is big into the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, but I like how he manages to write characters who have a lot of different perspectives on religion, and like a lot of characters who are either agnostics, don't believe in religion, or people who are questioning their faith. Like, I love the way he investigates that theme. It doesn't necessarily feel like it's biased towards believing in religion, which I quite like. And I'm impressed that he was able to write that, although who knows what he really believes as a person. Anyway, because from everything I've heard, Mormon church is not an easy one to leave, even if you wanted to. As well, some things about this book. So at the beginning of every chapter, similar to how it's done in Mistborn actually, there's like a little introduction thing, often a quote of some kind. So in part 1, I think it was like quotes of things that people had said like just before they died, like seconds before they died. And then in part 2, it was a letter from one character to another. And then in part 3, it's been a bunch of like research notes that Jasmine has been making in her research. And this is another case of like rereadability, because I know that when I first read a lot of this, I didn't really know what any of that was. Whereas now, again, I don't remember everything, but I have a pretty good idea about how those things connect into the bigger picture. Also, I remember there is one thing, I don't know when we learn it, but I remember when we learned it, I was like shocked. I think it's in one of the later books, and when we learned it, I thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe that's true. But now, it's so obvious. We're being told it all the time. I don't know how I didn't pick up on it the first time. Anyway, as well, I haven't really talked about the shard blades, which play a big part in this. So the shard blades are basically like magic swords, and certain people, like if you own a shard blade, it's kind of connected to you magically, and you summon it by like putting your arm out. And after 10 heartbeats, it will appear. And I love the way that Brandon Sanderson manages to take something like it's a magic sword that you can summon. He manages to make it so much more than that. Honestly, I guess the summary is just that I am really enjoying this and looking forward to continuing it. The other thing that I should mention is that I did finish off the Jaran book, the second one. What was it called? An Earthly Crown. I finished that one off, and I am glad that I was planning to go straight into the next one, because in a lot of ways the next one just continues the story. And I do think actually I have a copy of the third one in physical form, and I think it actually calls it Book 2. So the second and third books of the series are called Book 1 and Book 2, and really it is the same story continued. Like all these theatre people and this rebellion leader, they're still on the planet and traveling. And even though there were some discoveries and some drama at the end of that second book, what is it? An Earthly Crown, there was quite a climax at the end. But then the next book kind of really does just pick up straight from everything that's happened, and it feels like you're starting in the middle of a story, which is really weird, because I remembered that actually when I picked this book up in my 20s, I did actually pick up that third book first. And I read the whole thing, and all I really remembered from it is that Tess and this nomadic tribe guy, the leader of the nomadic tribe, were like on the run trying to escape from her brother that wanted to take her back to space. But like, how did I not realize it wasn't the first book in a series? No idea. So I have made it up to part 5. I'm very close to the end. I think my Kindle is telling me that I only have about an hour and a half left to go. And I've actually forgotten what happens in this last part, because I feel like most of the significant things that I remember from this first book just happened already. But maybe there'll be a surprise in this last part. Also, I'm very happy to see in this last part we're going to have Shalon again, because part 4 was just all the boys in the battles, and yeah, that's not my favorite. Although I will say, so the battles have a lot of like plot and emotional depth to them, and you're also still learning things about the magic through the battles, so that does help them to be like less annoying. But also, like, just so often in fantasy books, the big climax is a big battle, and for someone who doesn't really like battle scenes, it's kind of frustrating, even though I can see why. Anyway, I think the things that happen during this big battle have quite a big impact on the plot, and so they kind of excite me for the final part, and also I kind of just want to go into the next book. But also what I'm thinking is, like, it's taken me almost a full 3 weeks to read this book, and in the future, in my reading plans, I kind of expected these books to take me 2 weeks to read, but Oathbringer is even longer than Way of Kings, so that doesn't seem doable, does it? Maybe Oathbringer is even going to take me like a whole month? Oh dear, that's really going to mess up my reading plans. And like, just while I'm enjoying my Cosmere reread, I don't necessarily want it to like completely take over all of my reading. I'd like to still read a lot of other things. I think the only other thing I would probably mention about part 4 is there is this group in the army in the story called Bridge 4, and a lot of people really love Bridge 4, but when I first read the story, like especially in the later books where they're doing more things, I kind of never felt that attached to them and got quite bored with them. But I will admit, because I know on this reread who's important and the part they're going to play, and I think I just paid attention a lot more to the side characters than I did in the first read. Maybe it's because I have the spare brain capacity to do that, and also because I know of their importance, so I know that I should pay attention to it. So hopefully on my reread I'm going to enjoy Bridge 4 a lot more, although I mean I still suspect that I'm not going to like Delana and Adeline any more than I did on my first read. I do think I used to always talk about doing like a management focused book club around this series, because there is so many concepts in here about leadership that I think would be interesting to get into further. But on this reread, I still don't feel like I've had enough brain power to like focus in on that, other than like just at a high level. Anyway, as I said, my Kindle's now telling me only an hour and a half to go, so I can probably finish it. Maybe today, definitely by tomorrow.
Lazy Sunday mornings, hiding under covers. I don't mind staying in with.
No, so if I look like crap, it's because I feel like crap. But I have finished reading The Way of Kings. And I really enjoyed my reread of this. I was kind of worried, as I think I always am on a reread, that I wouldn't like this as much, but I think it really stood up for me. And as I said, it was just so rereadable, because on a reread, I picked up on so many things. So in that final 5th part, there were some things that I actually thought maybe didn't come to fruition until later books, but they were wrapped up in this, which makes sense because all the clues were in this book. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like this... So in a lot of ways, if you can hear my curtain blowing around, I don't know what it's doing. Anyway, I feel like in a lot of ways, this wraps itself up really well. Like, there is still a lot of questions about what's going to happen next, and there's still a lot of questions about the past. And there were kind of a couple of things that happened in that last part that are clearly just like setting up the anticipation for the next books. But mostly, a lot of what happens feels like a lot of the plot feels complete, and it's just like the bigger things about the world that are still left open, and of course things are going to keep happening. So I am excited to be continuing the next book in, I think the end of February. I'm a little bit worried because this took me so long to read. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get through Words of Radiance, and I suspect it's going to take longer than I want to plan for it to take, but I guess we'll just have to deal with that when we come to that. The other thing I did finish reading was the third Jaran book, which I keep forgetting the name. I think it's called His Conquering Sword. So I finished that off on my run this morning, which maybe if I hadn't gone for that run, I wouldn't feel so crap right now. But anyway, I did manage to finish off His Conquering Sword. It's such a strange book to talk about. In a lot of ways, it actually reminds me of the ACOTAR books, so A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas, mostly in that series from the second book really opens up to a more fuller cast. I guess in ACOTAR, you're still quite focused on the main character, and in this, you're not so focused on Tess. She is a main character, but there's also lots of other characters kind of getting their own story. And even though there are these like big galactic empire events unfolding, and even on this planet, there's kind of this bigger war happening that's having a big impact on the way the planet runs, or like the relative power of different kingdoms in this world. So there's a lot of like big things happening, but the focus is more on the relationships between different people, and there's so many relationships, like not just romantic but other kinds of oh, my neighbor just goes in and out, honestly. There's so many different kinds of relationships, and like an added level to this is the fact that there's all these different cultures, and it's really looking at where these cultures clash, and I guess like different misunderstandings that happen because of like this fundamental misunderstanding of each other's cultures. And there's definitely some things that happen in the book that felt fairly dissatisfying. Also, what I'm really confused about is I thought that this third book was the book that I read when I was 20-ish, but having read it, it's not the plot that I remember at all. But I've read all three, like I've read 3 of the 4 books now, and none of those 3 books felt like the plot that I remembered. And the 4th book definitely can't be the plot that I remembered, because like the 4th book has to have so many different things in it now, because like I don't know what direction the 4th book's going to go in, but so much has been introduced now that it couldn't be what I remembered. So I just think somewhere along the way between being 20 and being now, I made up a whole different plot in my head. Like it still kind of aligns with what happens, but I don't know, I'm really confused about my memories now. Just goes to show you can't really trust your memories even when they feel pretty concrete. But I'm not always mad about having a bad memory, because it does mean you can reread books and get a whole new experience from them. Anyway, if you have read any of the books that I read in this video, I would love to talk with you about them down in the comments, or let me know if you've been reading anything exciting lately. And of course, subscribe if you'd like to watch more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.